Making their homes in the mountains of Middle-earth, the Dwarves were not originally part of the design of Iluvatar, the supreme creator. Instead, they were formed by Aule the smith, one of the mighty Valar that ruled in Aman. Aule was himself a creation of Iluvatar, one of the Ainur who sang the Ainulindale in the timeless halls, before the creation of the universe. And though Aule knew the children of Iluvatar were to come, he was impatient to see them. Before the First Age and the awakening of the elves, Aule created the 7 dwarf fathers and made them in his likeness. He taught these new creatures his craft and much of his lore, and loved them as children. But Iluvatar was angered by his actions, for he had commanded the Valar to wait for the coming of his children, and not to create their own. Aule repented and offered to destroy the dwarves, but Iluvatar instead accepted them and adopted them as his own. Yet he would not suffer them to live before the coming of his firstborn, and so Aule put the dwarf fathers to sleep, until a time after the coming of the elves, when they would be awoken. Roughly a century after the elves first walked the shores of Cuiviénen, the dwarf fathers opened their eyes and the 7 clans of the dwarves were formed. Far to the east resided the clans of Ironfists, Stiffbeards, Blacklocks, and Stonefoots, and in the west, the Firebeards and Broadbeams, who originated in the Blue Mountains and built the great cities of Nogrod and Belegost. Finally, there were the Longbeards, also called Durin's folk, named after their first king, Durin the Deathless. They originated in Mount Gundabad and traveled west, settling the Misty Mountains and building the great mansion of Khazad-dûm, which would later be known as Moria. Also, they settled the Iron Hills, the Grey Mountains, and the Lonely Mountain. The dwarves of Belegost and Nogrod were early allies of the elves in the First Age, and joined them in the First Battle of Beleriand, where the dwarf armies of Belegost stood alone against the might of Glaurung, father of dragons. Though the alliance of dwarves and elves benefited both, it was not to last. The dwarves of Nogrod would go to war with the elves of Doriath for the sake of a precious necklace called the Nauglamir, which held a Silmaril as its central jewel. What followed was centuries of hatred and war between the races. In the Second Age, some of their differences would be reconciled, as 50,000 dwarven warriors of Durin's folk marched with elves and men in the War of the Last Alliance to defeat Sauron and the armies of Mordor. Yet in the Third Age, more strife would come, as the sack of the Lonely Mountain by the dragon Smaug the Terrible would lead to years of war between the dwarves and the orcs of Mordor. Thorin Oakenshield would eventually lead his people to reclaim the Lonely Mountain, but many would die in the wars, including the kings Thror and Thrain II. An attempt was also made by the dwarf Balin to take back the Misty Mountains and the mansion of Khazad-dûm. Balin was a great friend and ally to Thorin, and brought with him a mighty dwarf army which fought back the Balrog and Orc armies that now inhabited the mountain. For 5 years, they fought, but were eventually defeated, and every dwarf, including Balin himself, was slain. During the events of the War of the Ring, the dwarves remained largely out of the fighting, save for Gimli, son of Gloin, who was a central figure in the fight against Sauron and the destruction of the One Ring. After the defeat of Sauron, Gimli would lead many of Durin's folk to the Glittering Caves, where he would rule as Lord, until eventually traveling west with his friend the elf Legolas, becoming the first dwarf ever to travel to the Undying Lands of Aman. In the Fourth Age, King Duran VII took back Khazad-dûm at last, reconquering the Misty Mountains and bringing the Longbeard clan to live out their days in wealth and splendor. It is said the dwarf race continued to recede further and further from the world as time went on, until eventually becoming extinct in the Fifth Age.